Yeah, so actually, there's been a lot of really interesting discussion going on there, mostly around the nature of free will, which I sort of didn't expect. But there's a lot of people talking about, if we have free will, what's the point in doing anything? Could we even do science if we have free will? There's been lots of really interesting discussion in there. I sort of feel, I mean, one thing that hasn't been mentioned that always comes up in free will is the idea of, well, if someone commits a crime, do we have to, should we lock them up? And I sort of think, well, they can't help do the crime and we can't help lock them up. So, so I said a lot of discussion around that. But I've got a few specific questions. One of them was an interesting idea about religion, where Louise said animals don't have religion, but actually, as far as we're aware, but they do respond to death in a communal way, that they sort of become silent and they might comfort each other, and particularly I think in primates that might exist. So do you think therefore you could sort of, I think the implied question is, could you then take that into a human sense and have sort of secular ceremonies that incorporate all of the sort of tradition and sort of, what's the word, solemnity that a religious ceremony does?
Yeah, of course we can. The coping side of religion need not focus upon supernatural qualities. Supernatural qualities is a very powerful technique as a coping mechanism, because if the finite nature of life, if the ephemeral quality of existence is what you confront, then suggesting that there's something that's not finite, suggesting there's something that's not ephemeral, something that transcends and yet has the kind of human qualities that we revere, that's a natural and an effective strategy for many, but it's not the only strategy. Clearly, you can have responses to mortality that are completely distinct from a belief in any higher power. And there are many people who practice those kinds of rituals, and there are many people who find them as powerful a coping mechanism as the traditional religious orientation. So the answer is clearly yes. When it comes to animals, an interesting question, though, is, in the book, I make a point of noting that we are the only species that truly understands our own mortality. And some have responded to that, Martin, as you seem to be indicating in some of the questions. They say, no, there are other species that respond to death. No, I totally agree. But the point is, I do not think that there's another species that from birth to death wonders about their own mortality, walks around planet Earth and saying, oh, goodness gracious, what does it all mean if I'm going to die? I think that we are likely the only species that does that. However, if we're not the only species, if elephants actually do that, it only strengthens the argument regarding the power that the recognition of our own mortal nature has. It has a power perhaps not just on us, but maybe other species as well. So that only goes to strengthen the impact as opposed to diminish it.
And so how about that free will discussion, Brian?
Sure.
What is the point of getting up in the morning if none of it's up to us anyway?
Well, Martin gave an answer which is sometimes characterized as the kind of silly answer, but it's actually there's something, sorry about that, but it's a true answer. When one says, well, why don't I just sit back and let the world happen? I'm going to just sort of choose to not do anything. That, of course, is assuming that you have the very freedom that the hypothesis is that you don't have. So if you're going to sit for the rest of your life on the couch, that was what you were meant to do. That's what you were always going to do. It's not as though you somehow broke free of the inexorable progress from past to future and have broken the control that physical law has. So number one, you don't have the freedom that you think you have to sit on the couch. If you do it, that's what you were meant to do. That's what you're always going to do. But the deeper explanation is one that was the one that we touched on, Joe, looking at the lack of traditional free will as somehow making human behavior or making human motivation or making anything, flattening that all and draining it all of significance. I think that's a deeply incorrect response. That is not where these ideas take us. I think these ideas actually take us to a place of recognition of how spectacular it is that we have the capacity to think and feel and act and love and hate and create. The fact that we can do that, and it is nothing but physics acting itself on the particles of nature, should inspire us as opposed to cause a sense of dejection. I mean, when I do something that I'm proud of, and I mentioned this in the book, if I solve an equation or I write some sentence or I articulate some idea that I'm happy with, I will often in the back of my mind step back and say, wow, I'm glad my particles did that. I'm glad that the laws of general relativity and quantum mechanics and the standard model, I'm glad it all conspired so that my collection of particles happened to do that. So in some sense, it takes away a sense of achievement, but it shifts it from the very personal to just a recognition that we're part of this cosmic unfolding, and how wonderful is it to be part of that. So that's my antidote to perhaps that natural response.
I do hope.
Of course, I had to say that. I had no choice.
Well, I don't know. I can't. It still makes me feel. Maybe I need to sit with the ideas a bit more. But it still does make me feel a bit uncomfortable that if someone's on the couch and they're kind of just sitting there, maybe a bit depressed, that is this taking away that kind of spark or motivation that they would need to change something? I mean, I guess you would think that it doesn't make any difference because they don't have any free will anyway. But if you
but let's put that to the side. Yeah, so let's put that to the side, because that'll always burden every part of a conversation of this sort. Let's take away Martin's answer and leave it that we can speak more freely using language that seems to indicate free will, even though we're assuming that we don't have it. And could it take away that spark? It could. And therefore, some suggest that this way of thinking about things is dangerous and ultimately not helpful, not useful. But I do think that if you take that next step and you really allow an individual that sense of wonder, that all it is particles and laws, and yet we can do these things, I find that the spark can come back more strongly than it did before.
We got anything else?
Oh, yes. So there are a couple.
Sorry?
So I was going to say, there's a couple more people asked, I guess, slightly more off-tangent questions. Actually, there's quite an interesting one from Marcel, who asks, what do you think about the Gaia hypothesis? So using the analogy of neurons exchanging signals to give birth to a human consciousness, could humans exchanging signals give birth to planetary consciousness?
Yeah, it's a natural idea. And in the end of the day, from a highly reductionist perspective, it's all just collections of particles doing stuff. And sometimes the collection of particles are encased in an individual that we call a human. And sometimes the particles are encased in a number of collections of particles of that sort, which is a larger group of individuals that themselves, through exchanging of signals, might have some meta capacity to yield phenomenon that the individual might not be sensitive to. I allow that as a possibility. I don't see evidence of it yet. Some people say, look at the internet. The internet is that global intelligence. I don't see that yet. And certainly with the vast majority of things that we find in the internet, that would be a low-level intelligence. Maybe it can develop to a place where one would describe it as an entity, an intelligence of its own sort. I allow for the possibility. I don't think we're anywhere near that now.
That was one of this, when we were talking about consciousness, we didn't really have time to go through a lot of the approaches towards trying to understand that. And one of them was IIT. Is it integrated information? Integrated
information theory, yeah.
So the idea that if you've got the right amount of integrated information processing, you could have consciousness arise in any system.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, Giulio Tononi and Koch and others have argued that this is an approach not necessarily to explaining the origin of consciousness or what consciousness is, but rather it's an approach to knowing when it is present. So if there are certain conditions that are met, certain kind of information, certain kinds of connections between the modules that carry that information, that integrated quality, that whether that is taking place in a human brain or in an integrated circuit or on a global scale, that might reflect back to the first question that yes, you can have consciousness at any of those levels in principle.
It feels like it's a really interesting time at the moment, that there's so many different approaches at the moment, a lot of sort of open-mindedness about how we might get at this question.
And it's relatively new. I mean, there was a time that if you mentioned the word consciousness in scientific circles, you became a pariah. Nobody wanted to hear about consciousness. Nobody thought that that was an idea that was relevant to scientific investigation. That has changed. Now there's at least a recognition that this is a worthy subject, one that one day may yield stunning insights.
Yep. Any more, Martin?
Oh yeah, so this is a bit of a more of an off-topic question, and I'll add my own comment before you answer. But so Richard asks, what do you think of the anti-science attitude that many people in the USA seem to promote? Now I just jump in and say, I don't think that problem is just confined to the USA, but I would also add that we actually had a panel last week looking at specifically disinformation around vaccines and kind of online misinformation. This is a huge topic at the moment. So I guess I could probably narrow that question slightly and say, obviously we know there's a problem with fake news, with bad health information, bad information getting out there. How do we combat it, I guess, is probably the
it's a good question. And look, I'm happy to say, not happy to say, I'm willing to say that America is the poster child for this kind of anti-scientific outlook. And here's my thought on that. There's some who respond to this by saying, we need better science education. We need more scientists going out there and educating the public on science. And I wouldn't go against that, but I do not think that is the solution by any means, because when you encounter someone of a deeply anti-scientific attitude, I have certainly found that their views do not arise from the kind of typical judge and jury model that many of us have in thinking about rational thought. Many of us think that we come to our beliefs because we're presented with data about the world, we're presented with a variety of explanations for that data, and we think through those explanations, and the judge and the jury inside of our head comes down on this as the best explanation. But that is not at the root of many of the anti-scientific views. Instead, what's happening in many of these circumstances is it's group identity. Your group says that this is the way to look at the world. Your group is anti-vaccination. Your group supports Trump. And because you are part of that group, and that group is deeply part of your own identity, really matters to you, you take on the beliefs of that group, regardless of any kind of judge and jury evaluation of the beliefs of that group. So you can't combat that with better science education. You can't combat that with scientists going out. I mean, perhaps that can help, but what you really need to do is to listen to the group, listen to the grievances, listen to why it is that they have come together in some sort of block. What is it that's driving that kind of identity? And if you can crack that nut and figure out a way where people can feel that the world is serving them in a way that better aligns with the very basic necessities of human value and human life and human dignity, then I think there's at least a chance that you can make headway on this problem. And I think that has to go hand in hand with better science education and scientists going out and educating the world, because on their own, scientists and education won't do it.
I think there maybe are times as well when science doesn't always help itself. Like when I've written about medicine, for example, and for a long time, scientists were very skeptical about the idea that our minds are important in our physical health, for example. And I guess that sort of comes from a reductionism and some of the things you were talking about with, our consciousness can't affect our physical bodies, and that was sort of carried over into, and therefore our psychological state doesn't affect our physiology. And now that we absolutely know that it does, and that led to, I think, a real dismissal of some of the principles that were being found in alternative medicine, which do revolve a lot around belief and expectation and hope and care. And when you have that sort of dismissal of, well, this isn't possible, I think that does lead some people to then think, well, I know from experience that it does, and if science is saying that this isn't true, then maybe science isn't for me. And so perhaps, you know, some of this more open-mindedness that you're talking about of being science, taking consciousness more seriously, could perhaps help to bring some of those people back.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just in our conversation before, I think religion is another example there, where again, I'm not soft on religious claims regarding the physical universe. I am sharp and harsh that those claims are false. But I'm completely open, as we were discussing, to claims of religion as something that can be deeply valuable to the individual. And I think when scientists go out and basically say, if you have a religious belief, you are stupid, it's hard for me to see how that appeals to anybody who isn't already of that perspective, and how it isn't deeply obnoxious and counter to progress among those individuals who do hold beliefs that differ from perhaps those held by certain scientists.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Are there any more queuing up? I've got a couple of questions I still would really like to ask, but I'll defer to the audience if you have some good ones there.
I'll just throw in one more topic that the audiences have just been chatting about. So the topic of time travel came up, and this idea of, well, if I travel back in time, would that also be fate, and would that then mess with fate that's happened? But surely, maybe if there was no free will, I was just bound to do that. I was bound to travel in time, and so there's a bit of discussion around that. But I guess I could sort of frame it as a question by saying, I mean, do you think that would ever be possible? Is it fit? But in the sort of laws of physics, could I travel back to 1900?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because time travel to the future is part of physics as we understand it.
I'm doing it now.
Well, not just in the sense of going from moment to moment to the future. If you want to see what the Earth is like a billion years from now, I can tell you how to do that. Go out in a rocket ship, travel near the speed of light, turn around and come back. And if your journey is of the right speed at the right duration, when you come back, you might be 1 year older, but Earth would be a billion years older. Einstein taught us that is how reality works. It's hard to carry that out from a practical standpoint, but traveling to the future is part of science. Traveling to the past is the big unknown. There are proposals for how you might do it. I think most of us think that time travel to the past is not possible, but the question that the audience has raised is an interesting one. If it were possible, just hypothetically, could you go back and change the past? And most of us who think about this think the answer is no. That if you travel to the past, if you travel back, say, to January 1st, year 2000, then there was never a version of January 1st, 2000 when you were not there. You don't have, a premiere of a moment in time and then an encore of a moment in time. A moment of time happens once, and it is unchangeable, because for it to change, it wouldn't be a moment. Change means that you have multiple moments, and a moment of time doesn't have that quality. So if you travel to the past, you would have always been there, and your presence would have had an impact at that moment, and therefore it would lock into a completely self-consistent set of events. The weirdness would be that your presence at a future moment would have been prior to your moment at a past moment. That's weird, but it would be still logically sensible.
So you're saying this explains why there aren't time travelers here with us now?
No, there could be time travelers with us here right now. There could be. I could have traveled from the future to the past. I don't know how to do it, and I don't know if the laws of physics allow it, but logically speaking, there's nothing wrong with me being here and a younger version of myself having been in the future. That is not logically impossible. It may be physically impossible, but it doesn't break the rules of logic.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. I'll leave Jo to wrap up her final question.
Yeah, well, we're nearly out of time, not quite. So I'm going to just squeeze in two more questions, which you can answer in either order. One is, if there is any young people watching who are thinking about taking up science as a career, what would you say to them? Do you have any sort of words of advice or inspiration? And the other one is that you mentioned in the book an experience when you were, I think you mentioned it actually earlier in our conversation as well, when you were camping on a survival course, and it was cold and muddy and unpleasant, and you looked up and saw the stars, the northern lights, and that was quite a powerful experience for you. And so I just wanted to know, is that sort of, you talk about how physics connects you with the cosmos, but is that more personal, sort of direct connection with the stars? Is that something that's a big part of your life? And do you worry about light pollution and Elon Musk's satellites. You know,
Yeah.
do you think it's important that we can all sort of connect with the universe in that way as well?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I read your book, Jo. You did a wonderful job of explaining how throughout the course of human history, the stars have had such a profound impact on how we think about ourselves and how we think about the universe. And I have long felt that way. I think one of the great tragedies of modern civilization is that we live in cities, and a starry night in New York City means you can see 2 stars. And I think that is a deep and profound loss, because I perhaps naively feel that if we all felt connected to the wider cosmos, and how better to do that than every night to witness the glorious cosmos out there. I just think the world would be a far better place if we all had that sensibility. But just go back to your other question in terms of young kids. Look, I would say science is a profoundly moving arena of human exploration. And there's nothing more exciting than finding something out about the world, about the universe that no one has ever seen before. I've only had that experience a handful of times, but they are profound moments when you do feel that connection, because you understand something more deeply than perhaps anybody has yet understood it. At the same time, I would say, as scientists, you need to leave yourself open to the profound human experiences of human life, and those are not distinct. Allow yourself to experience the poetry and the art and the music and all the distinct ways of engaging with reality that may not be scientific at their core, because it is only through the collective, the human collective, that you really gain a full sense of who we are as a species.
Thank you so much, Brian, for an absolutely fascinating evening. I could talk all night. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. And just to say one more time, if there's anyone left who hasn't read this book yet, it really is wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.